Warning: this story contains extreme violence, slasher elements, and murder. I encourage you to listen to the entire story, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated. The island was a paradise by day, a hell by night. When Mia and Derek arrived, they had no idea that this remote stretch of tropical beauty, hidden away from the mainland, harbored ancient horrors. After a long flight, they had settled into their cozy, secluded villa, surrounded by thick jungle on one side and endless turquoise waters on the other. It felt like an escape from reality. But that was the problem. They hadn't realized how quickly reality could slip away. The first few days were spent exploring the local markets, indulging in exotic food, and getting lost in each other's company. They marveled at the unspoiled beauty of the island, at the warmth of the sun on their skin, and the sound of waves lapping against the shore. It was bliss, until the night everything changed. The video: it was the evening of their third day when Mia first noticed something strange. Derek had gone out to grab drinks from the bar on the beach, and she decided to scroll through her phone. She flipped open the gallery to review photos from the day. That's when she saw it, a video. One she didn't remember recording. Her hand trembled as she clicked play. The screen flickered. Mia squinted in confusion as the grainy footage came to life. It was a recording of her and Derek in their villa, just a few hours earlier. In the video, Derek was smiling, holding a glass of wine, just like he had been that afternoon. But something was terribly wrong. In the video, Mia was lying lifeless on the bed, blood pooling beneath her neck, eyes wide open in a final, frozen expression of horror. Derek turned towards the camera, a maniacal grin spreading across his face, before slashing his own throat with a jagged piece of glass. Mia dropped her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. "What the hell?" she whispered. When Derek returned moments later, she was still frozen in shock, the phone on the floor. "Hey, babe, you okay?" His voice was all Mia could see was the image of his blood-splattered face in the video, the dead-eyed version of herself. She slowly backed away from him, her mind spinning. Derek noticed her change in demeanor, his brows knitting in concern. "Mia? What's wrong?" "I just saw something." "I don't understand," she stammered. Her voice cracked. "There's a video. We're both dead." "I saw us die," Derek laughed nervously. "What? That's impossible. You probably just saw something weird online." "No, Derek." She pointed toward the phone. "Look," he hesitated, but eventually reached for the phone. The video began playing again. As it unfolded, Derek's face drained of color. "What the fuck? That's us, Derek," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "That's us." And we're dead at the phone, his face contorted in disbelief. He rewound the video again, watching in stunned silence as his on-screen doppelganger slit his own throat with a jagged shard of glass. The video was too real, too graphic. The blood splattered in thick waves, covering the camera lens as Mia's lifeless body lay still on the bed. "No, this can't be real," Derek muttered, backing away from the phone as though it might leap up and attack him. Mia's pulse raced. "We need to leave, Derek. Now." Derek shook his head, trying to shake off the fog of dread creeping into his mind. "Leave? Mia, this has to be some kind of sick joke." "A joke? Does this look like a joke?" Mia screamed, her voice breaking with panic as she threw the phone at him. "We're going to die. Don't you get it?" Derek stood frozen for a moment, before rushing to the door and locking it, as if barricading themselves inside would protect them from whatever was happening. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the pounding of their hearts and the slow creak of the ceiling fan. "We'll talk to the staff tomorrow," Derek finally said, trying to sound calm, but his voice shook. Maybe someone is messing with us, hacking our phones or something. But Mia knew it wasn't that simple. There was something wrong with this place. Ever since they'd arrived, there had been a lurking unease, strange looks from the locals. Cryptic comments about the island's past. Something was deeply, horribly wrong here. The midnight revelation, the night felt endless. Neither of them could sleep. Mia kept replaying the video in her mind, hearing the wet slash of Derek's throat being cut over and over again. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like a harbinger of something terrible waiting to descend upon them. It wasn't until past midnight when they, like nails scratching at the glass of their bedroom window. Mia froze, her body stiffening under the sheets. Derek was still beside her, his breathing shallow and quick. They locked eyes, silently confirming that they both had heard it. Tap. 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 The sound was insistent, deliberate. Slowly, Mia slid out of bed, her body trembling with fear. She approached the window cautiously, inching her way closer, her breath fogging the glass. When she peeled back the curtain, she gasped in terror. Standing just outside the window, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a woman. Her long, matted hair clung to her skeletal face, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural, piercing brightness. Her lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, and her skin was covered in deep, festering cuts. One of her hands tapped at the window, the nails long and cracked, leaving faint streaks of blood on the glass. "Mia," Derek whispered, pulling her back from the window, "get away from there." But it was too late. The woman's eyes snapped to Mia's, locking her in place. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she heard the woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, in her mind, "You're part of the ritual now." Suddenly, the glass shattered, spraying shards everywhere. The woman's hand shot through the window, clawing at Mia's arm, drawing blood. Mia screamed, scrambling backward as Derek rushed forward, grabbing a piece of broken glass to slash at the woman's hand. The woman's mouth opened in a silent scream, her eyes rolling back into her head as she withdrew her hand and disappeared into the night. Blood dripped down Mia's arm, the cuts deep and stinging. She could barely speak as Derek pulled her back from the window, his own hands shaking. What the hell was that? Mia gasped, clutching her bleeding arm. "I don't know," Derek muttered, his voice trembling. "But we're leaving. Now." The descent into the jungle path leading away from the villa, the thick foliage closing in around them as they hurried toward the beach. The night air was heavy with humidity, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant crash of waves, felt like a threat. But the deeper they ran into the jungle, the more they realized there was no escaping. The path twisted in unnatural ways, doubling back on itself. Trees that should have been familiar suddenly felt alien, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. And then, the whispers started. Low, unintelligible voices floated on the air, growing louder with every step they took. Mia's pulse quickened, her heart thundering in her chest. She knew they were being followed. "Stalked, Derek," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own footsteps. "Something's coming." Derek turned, his face pale and dripping with sweat. "I know. Just keep moving." But the jungle itself seemed to be working against them. The ground beneath their feet grew soft, as if they were treading on flesh, and the trees twisted and writhed, their branches intertwining to form grotesque shapes. Mia could see figures moving in the shadows, human-like, but distorted, their limbs too long, their faces too pale. Suddenly, the path opened up into a clearing, and they stumbled into a wide circle of torches surrounding an ancient stone altar. Mia gasped, her eyes widening in horror at the sight before her. Bodies. Dozens of bodies, all in various states of decay, were draped over the altar, their flesh torn open, their bones picked clean. Blood pooled around the stone, dripping into the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of death. Before they could react, figures emerged from the shadows, hooded, robed figures carrying ceremonial blades. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but their intentions were clear. But the hooded figures closed in, their knives glinting in the torchlight. One of them stepped forward, his mask adorned with twisted, gory symbols. He raised his hand, and the others fell silent. "Welcome," the figure said in a deep, rasping voice. "You've been chosen to complete the ritual." Derek stepped in front of Mia, his fists clenched, his eyes wild with desperation. "What the fuck do you want from us?" The leader tilted his head, regarding Derek with something almost akin to amusement. "Your deaths," he said simply. "Your blood is the final offering." Mia's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the video in her pocket, the one showing their deaths. It hadn't been a warning. It was a prophecy. "No," she whispered, stepping forward. "We won't let you do this." The leader laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You have no choice. It's already begun." Before they could react, two of the hooded figures lunged at Derek, grabbing him by the arms and forcing him to his knees. He struggled, but their grip was too strong. "Mia!" he shouted, his voice raw with fear. "Run!" But Mia couldn't move. She was frozen in place as the leader approached her, his knife glinting in the firelight. He raised it high above his head, and in that moment, Mia knew there was no escape. The blade came down with a sickening thud, and Mia screamed as Derek's blood sprayed across the arm with brutal force, slicing into Derek's shoulder as his scream tore through the jungle air. Blood poured out in torrents, pooling beneath him as the two figures held him fast. His cries echoed through the clearing, mixing with Mia's horrified scream as she watched her husband being butchered before her eyes. "Stop!" Mia shrieked, but the hooded figures paid no attention. The leader pulled the blade out of Derek's shoulder, its edge dripping with blood, and raised it again. This time, it came down on Derek's chest. The sound of the blade cutting through bone and flesh made Mia retch, her knees buckling beneath her. She tried to run, tried to force her legs to move. But it was like the ground had swallowed her whole. Her limbs were heavy, her mind spinning in a nauseating whirl of terror and disbelief. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. Derek's voice was raw now, reduced to pitiful, ragged gasps. His eyes found Mia's in the firelight, his expression pleading for help that she couldn't give. Mia wanted to look away, to shut her eyes and pretend this wasn't happening, but she couldn't tear her gaze from him. With one final, sickening thrust, the leader drove the blade deep into Derek's chest, splitting his heart open. Derek's body convulsed violently before going limp, his head slumping forward as blood poured from the wound. Mia screamed, her voice hoarse and broken. As the life drained from her husband's body, "Your turn," the leader said, his voice cold and emotionless, as he turned his gaze to Mia. He pulled the blade from Derek's body with a sickening squelch, wiping the blood off on his robe. Mia's body went cold. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but her limbs felt paralyzed, as though an invisible force was holding her in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The hooded figures closed in on her. Mia stumbled backward, but two of them grabbed her arms, pinning her to the altar where Derek's blood still pooled, sticky and warm against her skin. The smell of copper and decay filled her nostrils, making her gag. The leader approached her, his face obscured by the grotesque mask, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You should feel honored," he said, his voice a low hiss. "This ritual has been performed for centuries. Your blood will keep the island's power alive." Mia thrashed against their grip, her mind racing with terror. "No," She screamed, her voice cracking. "Please, don't do this. I don't want to die." The leader laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "It's not about what you want. It's about what the island needs." Before she could scream again, he raised the blade high above his head, preparing to strike. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, every second stretching into an eternity, but just as the blade began its deadly descent, the clearing was suddenly filled with an ear-splitting scream, not Mia's, but something inhuman, something monstrous. The robed figures stopped in their tracks, their heads snapping toward the jungle as the sound grew louder. Out of the darkness, the woman from the window appeared, her gaunt, skeletal figure gliding toward them. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, her mouth twisted into a hideous grin as she floated toward the altar. Her presence sent a ripple of fear through the group. Even the leader taking a step back as she approached. "You," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally, "are mine." Without warning, the woman lunged at the leader, her claw-like hands wrapping around his throat. He gasped, choking as her nails dug into his flesh, black blood oozing from the wounds. His body convulsed as her grip tightened, his eyes bulging with terror. Mia watched, frozen in shock, as the leader's body withered before her eyes, his skin shriveling and cracking as the woman drained the life from him. Figures screamed, dropping their knives and running toward the jungle, but the woman was faster. She moved with an unnatural speed, her limbs twisting and contorting as she hunted them down one by one. She tore through their flesh with her bare hands, ripping them apart with grotesque ease. Blood sprayed across the clearing, splattering Mia as she lay on the altar, her mind unable to process the carnage unfolding before her. Limbs were severed, heads torn from bodies, and organs spilled onto the jungle floor as the woman decimated the group. Their screams were short-lived, silenced by the brutal violence of their deaths. In mere moments, the clearing was silent once more, save for the dripping of blood and the crackling of the torches. The woman stood in the center, her skeletal frame covered in gore, her glowing eyes fixed on Mia. Mia's heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from this nightmare, but her body refused to move. The woman approached her slowly, her movements fluid and unnatural. She reached out, her bloodied hand brushing against Mia's cheek, leaving a streak of blackened blood in its wake. "You're part of the island now," the woman whispered, her voice soft and haunting. "There's no escape." Mia's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't kill me." The woman's lips twisted into a sickening smile. "You won't die. Not yet. But you'll wish you had." Before Mia could react, the woman pressed her hand to Mia's chest. A searing pain shot through her body, like fire coursing through her veins. Mia screamed, arching her back as the pain intensified, her vision blurring. She could feel something inside her shifting, twisting, as though her very soul was being torn apart. Then, everything went black. When Mia awoke, the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, she thought it had all been a terrible dream. But when she sat up, the smell of blood still clung to her skin, and the memory of the night's horrors came flooding back. Derek's body. The ritual. The woman, Mia stumbled out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran to the bathroom, desperate to wash the stench of blood off her skin. But when she looked in the mirror, she froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. The woman from the night before stood in the mirror, her hollow eyes and twisted smile mocking Mia. "No," Mia whispered, backing away from the mirror. "No, this isn't real." But the reflection only grinned wider, her voice echoing in Mia's mind. "You're part of me now. There's no escape." Mia's hands flew to her face, feeling her own skin, but the reflection remained unchanged. She could feel something inside her, something dark and twisted, growing stronger with every passing second. She wasn't Mia anymore, she was the island. As the days passed, Mia tried to leave the island, but no matter how far she ran, she always ended up back at the villa. The island wouldn't let her go. It needed her now. She was trapped in an endless loop of terror, reliving the night's horrors over and over again. Every time she tried to escape, the island pulled her back, forcing her to confront the blood and death that now defined her existence. And as the nights grew longer, the island's dark secrets began to consume her. The ritual was complete. The island had its power, and Mia would never. Shallow gasps as she backed away from the mirror, her reflection still twisted into the nightmarish grin of the woman who haunted her dreams. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. No matter how hard she rubbed her eyes, pinched her skin, or whispered desperate prayers, the image stayed the same, her body, but not her soul. The island's grip on her was tightening. Every minute she spent there, the boundaries between her and the spirit of the woman blurred further. The smell of Derek's blood, the sound of his last gasp, everything was burned into her memory, but the realization she had no escape was far worse. Outside the window, the sun was setting, bathing the villa in a blood-red glow. The shadows lengthened, creeping across the floor like fingers reaching out to claim her. Mia knew what would come next. The night would bring more horrors. The island wouldn't let her rest. Get out. I have to get out, she muttered to herself, her voice trembling. Her legs were shaky, barely holding her up as she stumbled toward the door. Every step felt like wading through quicksand. The weight of the island pressed down on her, pulling her back. Mia could feel it in her bones, the way the air thickened, suffocating her, as though the island itself was alive, watching, waiting. Mia staggered outside, into the thick, humid air of the jungle. The villa loomed behind her, its windows dark and silent, like the eyes of a predator stalking its prey. She broke into a run, her feet crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that tore at her skin and the roots that threatened to trip her. She had to get to the boat. The boat. The only way off this goddamn island. But the further she ran, the more disoriented she became. The jungle twisted around her, paths she had memorized earlier in the trip now unfamiliar and alien. The trees seemed to close in, branches interlocking like prison books. She was lost. A rustling sound in the bushes made her freeze. Something was moving. It was too deliberate, too focused. Mia's mind flashed to the woman, the thing that had killed Derek, the same monstrous entity that was now devouring her soul. No. Mia whispered, her voice barely audible as she spun around, eyes darting in every direction. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, but it wasn't the woman. It was Derek. Mia's heart lurched painfully in her chest. He stood there, just a few feet away, looking exactly as he had the last time she saw him before the ritual, alive, unscathed, no blood, no wounds. Derek. She stammered, stumbling toward him, tears already forming in her eyes. You're alive. How? He didn't speak. His eyes were vacant, hollow. And as she got closer, the air around him seemed to shimmer, like a mirage in the heat. Derek? She said again, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch him, her fingers brushing his skin. The instant they made contact, his body dissolved into black smoke, swirling around her like a whirlwind. Mia screamed, stumbling back as the smoke wrapped around her, suffocating her, filling her lungs with the stench of death. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The smoke whispered to her, voices echoing in her mind. You're ours now. There is no escape. No escape. Mia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the smoke dissipated into the jungle. Her hands clawed at the dirt, her body trembling uncontrollably. The island was playing with her. It was twisting reality, warping it into something unrecognizable, a waking nightmare she couldn't escape. She scrambled to her feet, her mind reeling. There was no boat. There was no way off. The island wasn't going to let her leave, but she couldn't stop trying. Mia continued running, her bare feet bleeding from the rocks and roots, a maze of green and shadow that shifted and twisted as she ran. And always, she could hear the whispers, the voices of the island, taunting her, laughing at her. Finally, she burst through the tree line and onto the beach. The boat was there. Mia's heart leaped with hope, a flicker of light in the all-encompassing darkness. She sprinted toward the water, her legs screaming with pain, but she didn't care. She reached the boat and scrambled inside, her hands fumbling with the ropes as she tried to untie it, but the boat didn't move. Panic surged through her. The tide was pulling at the boat, but it wouldn't budge. Mia looked down, her heart plummeting. The boat was chained to the shore, thick, rusty chains that wrapped around the hull, anchoring it to the sand. No. Mia screamed, pulling at the chains with all her strength, her fingers slipping on the wet metal. Please, God, no. The chains were too strong. She couldn't break them. Behind her, the sound of footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. Mia's blood turned to ice. She turned around, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The woman was standing at the edge of the water, her gaunt figure silhouetted against the rising moon. Her eyes glowed with that same unnatural light, her grin wide and grotesque. In her hand, she held the ceremonial knife, the same one she had used on Derek. No. Mia whimpered, backing away. Please, no. The woman's smile widened, and she took a step forward. Mia's back hit the edge of the boat. There was nowhere left to run. Nowhere to hide. The woman raised the knife, her eyes locked on Mia's. This is your fate, she whispered, her voice echoing with the power of the island. You belong to us now. Mia's scream was swallowed by the sound of the waves crashing against the shore as the woman lunged forward, the knife flashing. And next morning, the island was calm. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the beach. The villa stood silent and empty, its windows reflecting the peaceful ocean. There was no sign of Mia, no blood. No bodies, just the endless expanse of the jungle, and the quiet whisper of the wind through the trees. Far out at sea, a fishing boat passed by the island, its crew unaware of the horrors that had unfolded just beyond their view. One of the fishermen glanced toward the shore, catching sight of something, a woman, standing at the edge of the water. She was pale, her hair hanging in long, wet strands around her face. Her eyes seemed to glow with an eerie light, and as the boat passed, she smiled, but it wasn't a smile of welcome, it was a smile of possession. The fisherman shivered, turning away from the island. Cursed place, he muttered to himself. Best not to go near it. The island remained as it always had, a place of mystery, fear, and death. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the jungle, the island whispered its ancient secrets, waiting for the next soul to claim.